The Road to War. Written and narrated by John Miro. Get more at servingworlds.com. "47. Only a few soldiers had been on their feet. None had put up a fight worth mentioning, and none had been hurt beyond being rendered unconscious. So long as they could put an end to this fast, a few injections and some bed rest would be the only consequences for the officers unlucky enough to find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lee felt good. He felt great. His implant's bio-controls and the short rest, break, and feed on the tender was enough to tide his body over, and his mind was gloriously awake and free, and serving a purpose. Purpose. That word kept evolving for him. Lee never thought about what he had to do during the Civil War. He just did it. He'd lost everything to Earth. He still had. But now here he was, still fighting. For Reach and for Earth. It felt good to be part of a group again. It felt good to be trusted, needed, useful. And he was protecting people again. He looked down at the Alliance tunic he was wearing. It fit well. It felt right. He trusted Major Carson to lead. He felt safe following Noelle's lead and leading others after her, helping, protecting. It all felt right. That was what he loved about soldiering, though he'd never used that word before. Not about himself, not really. The team gathered behind him, and the moment of introspection was over. They came to a stop near the end of the final hallway on their journey. The group didn't lose its focus. Slow and steady and all business. Private Padalecki knelt beside Lee and extended a strip of shiny reflective metal around the corner. She dragged it back fast and turned wide eyes to the others. Her hands shook as she forced them into the symbols for the others to understand. 5 men, she signed silently. With their skill, surprise on their side, and the atmosphere as an advantage, 5 men wasn't so bad. Lee saw Willard grin, thinking the same, no doubt, and Jake pout for probably the same reasons. The big man's blood was up. Lee knew he didn't like killing. He didn't want to do any real damage, but the big bruiser hadn't even gotten the chance to knock some heads on this mission. As Lee watched, both men's faces went slack. He turned back to Padalecki and watched as she signed something else, the flesh pressed white with the force she pressed into her fingers. 3 mechs. Noelle dropped her head, and Lee let himself fall silently against the wall. A single mech could cut all of them to ribbons. Worse yet, mechs had their own air supply, so no easy victory here. Lee scraped nervously at his jaw. It was insane. Mechs weren't ever utilized in-ship. Too much could go wrong with something so powerful inside a confined, pressurized space floating in a vacuum. These mechs were definitely the bad guys. Major Carson tapped her wrist. They didn't have time for this. She met every eye and nodded. Every eye met hers, and every fighter nodded back. Noelle smiled and signed out her plan. Jake and Noelle would go first. They were part of Return's complement, and the badges on their uniforms wouldn't stand out. To get them closer before the shit hit the fan, Noelle suggested some other precautions. Somewhere in her arsenal of military training in subterfuge and counterintelligence, Noelle found a girlish giggle. She stumbled around the corner, faking being out of control, arms flailing for balance, as she took note of 2 mechs, one on either side of the council room. The third of them was at the far end of the hall. All 3 were scout mechs, lightly armored and lightly armed, but more than a match for their team in direct confrontation. Hence the giggle. "Get back here!" Jake yelled after her. He appeared around the corner, his t-shirt gone, his uniform jacket inside out and unbuttoned. She squealed and stumbled forward. She was met with laughter and ragged cheers. Only 3 of the 5 armed guards present were still on their feet. The conscious ones were still affected, though, and stumbled towards Noelle with catcalls and open arms. She shushed them with a finger to her lips and a manufactured guilty look on her face, and carried on stumbling down the hall. Jake followed, bouncing off the first mech and falling on his ass. He pretended to sober up enough to notice there was a mech standing in front of him. His jaw dropped. He pointed and broke out in giggles. One of the oxygen-starved guards helped him to his feet. "Go get her," he slurred drunkenly. Jake hugged him tight, giving every appearance of a man struggling to stay on his feet. Go on." The guard pushed him down the hall and stared after, mouth open and panting as he watched. "Reed," called a woman's voice from the mech on the far side of the council door. "I'm enjoying her jiggle too, but if anything else with a pulse comes around that corner, make it meet." "Yes, Shin," a man's voice agreed from the speakers of the other mech, as Carson and Garner cleared the far corner. Their giggles and footsteps faded. The mech at the end of the corridor stomped around in place and watched after them for a moment, then turned back around. Again the corridor was silent, save for a low hiss emanating from the side of the mech belonging to Reed. The improvised explosive Jake had mixed inside a tube and stuffed into the hip joint of the mech exploded. Jake's Civil War-era guerrilla training had been put to good use. The leg of Reed's mech disappeared and reduced the 3 men still standing to a spray of mist and gore. The remains of the 3 guards were still dripping from the walls when Lee whipped a thin stream of crysteel down the hall and covered the helmet of the second mech. He sent a data attack through the crysteel filament. The mech was now blinded. Just in time for Padalecki and Willard to charge down the hall, opening fire. You have been listening to Reach, The Road to War. Written and narrated by John Miro. Music, All This by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Hear more of the story at servingworlds.com. Thank you for listening.